When Alexey Alexandrovitch reached the race-course, Anna was already in her place beside Betsy in the grand pavilion, where all the highest society was gathered in a brilliant throng. She saw her husband from a distance. Two men, her husband and her lover, were for her the two centres of life, and without the help of her external senses she felt their presence. Even when her husband was at a distance, she was conscious of his presence, and she involuntarily followed him in that billowing throng in the midst of which he was coming along. She saw him approach the pavilion, now replying with condescension to ingratiating salutations, then cordially or carelessly exchanging greetings with his equals, then again assiduously watching to catch the glances of the great ones of the earth, and taking off his large round hat, which came down to the top of his ears. Anna knew all these mannerisms of salutation, and they were all equally distasteful to her. Nothing but ambition, craze for success, it is all that his heart contains, she thought, but his lofty views, his love for civilization, his religion, they are only means whereby to win success. From the glances that Karenin cast on the pavilion, he was looking straight at his wife, but could not see her in the sea of muslin, ribbons, feathers, flowers, and sunshades. Anna knew he was looking for her, but she pretended not to see him. "Alexey Alexandrovitch!" cried the Princess Betsy. "Don't you see your wife? Here she is!" He looked up with his icy smile. "Everything is so brilliant here that it blinds the eyes," he replied as he came up the pavilion. He smiled at Anna, as it is a husband's duty to do when he has only just left his wife, greeted Betsy and his other acquaintances, conducting himself in due form, in other words, jesting with the ladies and exchanging compliments with the men. A general adjutant, well known for his wit and culture, and highly esteemed by Alexey Alexandrovitch, was standing below near the pavilion. Alexey Alexandrovitch joined him and engaged in conversation. It was the interval between two of the races. The general adjutant condemned racing. Alexey Alexandrovitch replied and defended them. Anna heard his shrill, monotonous voice, and lost not a single word, and every word that he spoke seemed to her hypocritical and rang unpleasantly in her ear. When the four-verst handicap race began, she leaned forward, not letting Vronsky out of her sight for an instant. She saw him approach his horse, then mount it, and at the same time she heard her husband's odious, incessant voice. She was tormented with fear for Vronsky, but she was tormented still more by the sound of her husband's sharp voice, every intonation of which she knew. It seemed to her that he would never cease speaking. "I am a wicked woman, a lost woman," she thought, "but I hate falsehood. I cannot endure lies. But to him," meaning her husband, "lies are his daily food. He knows all. He sees everything. How much feeling has he, if he can go on speaking with such calmness? I should have some respect for him if he killed me, if he killed Vronsky. But no, what he prefers above everything is falsehood and conventionality," said Anna to herself, not exactly knowing what she wanted of her husband, whatever she might want him to see. She did not understand that the very volubility of Alexey Alexandrovitch, which irritated her so, was only the expression of his interior agitation and anxiety. As a child, hurt when jumping, puts its muscles into motion to assuage the pain, so Alexey Alexandrovitch absolutely required some intellectual movement so as to become oblivious to the thoughts about his wife that arose in his mind at the sight of Anna and at the sight of Vronsky, whose name he heard on all sides. And as it is natural for a child to jump, so for him was it natural to talk tersely and well. "Danger," he was saying, "is an indispensable condition in these military and cavalry races. If England can show in her history the most glorious deeds of arms performed by her cavalry, she owes it solely to the historic development of vigor in her people and her horses. Sport, in my opinion, has a deep significance, and, as usual, we take it only in its superficial aspect." "Not superficial," said the Princess Tverskaya. "They say that one of the officers has broken 2 ribs." Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled with his smile which only uncovered his teeth and was perfectly expressionless. "Let us admit, princess," said he, "that in this case it is not superficial, but serious. But that is not the point," and he turned again to the general and resumed his dignified discourse. "You must not forget that those who take part are military men who have chosen this career, and you must agree that every vocation has its reverse side of the medal. This belongs to the calling of war. Such brutal sport as boxing matches and Spanish bullfights are indications of barbarism, but specialized sport is a sign of development." "No, I won't come another time," the Princess Betsy was saying. "It is too exciting for me. Don't you think so, Anna?" "It is exciting, but it is fascinating," said another lady. "If I had been a Roman, I should never have missed a single gladiatorial show." Anna did not speak, but, with her opera glass, was gazing intently at a single spot. At this moment a tall general came across the pavilion. Alexey Alexandrovitch, breaking off his discourse abruptly, arose with dignity and made a low bow. "Aren't you racing?" asked the general, jestingly. "My race is a far more difficult one," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch respectfully, and though this answer was not remarkable for its sense, the military man seemed to think that he had received a witty repartee from a witty man, and appreciated le point de la sauce. "There are two sides to the question," Alexey Alexandrovitch said, resuming, "that of the participants and that of the spectators. I confess that a love for such spectacles is a genuine sign of inferiority in those that look on, but—" "Princess, a wager!" cried the voice of Stepan Arkadyevitch from below, addressing Betsy. "Which side will you take?" "Anna and I bet on Prince Kuzolov," replied Betsy. "I am for Vronsky. A pair of gloves." "Good!" "How jolly, isn't it?" Alexey Alexandrovitch stopped speaking while this conversation was going on around him, and then he began anew. "I confess, unmanly games." But at this instant the signal of departure was heard, and all conversation ceased. Alexey Alexandrovitch also ceased speaking, and everyone stood up so as to look at the river. But Alexey Alexandrovitch was not interested in the race, and so, instead of watching the riders, he looked around the assembly with weary eyes. His gaze fell on his wife. Her face was pale and stern. She evidently saw nothing and no one except one person. Her hands convulsively clutched her fan. She held her breath. Karenina looked at her, then hastily turned away, gazing at the faces of other women. "There is another lady very much moved, and still another just the same. It is very natural," said Alexey Alexandrovitch to himself. He did not wish to look at her, but his gaze was irresistibly drawn to her face. He once more gazed into her face, trying not to read in it what was so plainly pictured on it, and against his will he read, without feelings of horror, all that he had tried to ignore. When Kuzovlev fell at the river, the excitement was general, but Alexey Alexandrovitch saw clearly by Anna's pale triumphant face that he that fell was not the one on whom her gaze was riveted. When, after Makotin and Vronsky crossed the great hurdle, another officer was thrown head first and was picked up for dead, a shudder of horror ran through the assembly. But Alexey Alexandrovitch perceived that Anna did not even notice it, and scarcely knew what the people around her were talking about. But he kept studying her face with deeper and deeper attention. Anna, all absorbed as she was in the spectacle of Vronsky's course, was conscious that her husband's cold eyes were on her. She turned around for an instant and looked at him questioningly. Then with a slight frown she turned away. "Ah, it's all the same to me," she seemed to say as she turned her gaze to the race. She did not look at him again. The race was disastrous. Out of the 17 riders more than half were thrown and hurt. Toward the end the excitement became intense, the more because the emperor was displeased. All were loudly expressing their dissatisfaction, and the phrase was going the rounds, "Now only the lions are left in the arena." And when Vronsky fell, horror was felt by all, and Anna groaned in dismay. In this there was nothing extraordinary. But, from thence on, a change which was positively improper had come over her face, and she entirely lost her presence of mind. She tried to escape, like a bird caught in a snare. Thus she struggled to arise, and to get away, and then she cried to Betsy, "Come, let us go, let us go!" But Betsy did not hear her. She was leaning over, engaged in lively conversation with a general who had just entered the pavilion. Alexey Alexandrovitch hastened to his wife and courteously offered her his arm. "Come, if it is your wish to go," said he in French, but Anna was listening eagerly to what the general said, and paid no attention to her husband. "He has broken his leg, they say, but this is not at all likely," said the general. Anna did not look at her husband, but taking her glass, she gazed at the place where Vronsky had fallen. It was so distant, and the crowd was so dense, that she could not make anything out of it. She dropped her binocle and started to go, but at that instant an officer came galloping up to make some report to the emperor. Anna leaned forward and listened. "Stiva! Stiva!" she cried to her brother. He did not hear her. She again made an effort to leave the pavilion. "I again offer you my arm, if you wish to go," repeated Alexey Alexandrovitch, touching her hand. Anna drew back from him with aversion, and replied without looking at him, "No, no, leave me. I am going to stay." She now saw an officer riding at full speed across the racecourse from the place of the accident to the pavilion. Betsy beckoned to him with her handkerchief. The officer brought the news that the rider was uninjured, but the horse had broken her back. When she heard this, Anna quickly sat down and hid her face behind her fan. Alexey Alexandrovitch noticed, not only that she was weeping, but that she could not keep back the tears or even control the sobs that heaved her bosom. He stepped in front of her to shield her from the public gaze and give her a chance to regain her self-command. "For the third time I offer you my arm," said he, turning to her at the end of a few moments. Anna looked at him, not knowing what to say. The Princess Betsy came to her aid. "No, Alexey Alexandrovitch, I brought Anna, and I will be responsible for bringing her home," said Betsy, interfering. "Excuse me, princess," he replied, politely smiling, and looking her full in the face. "But I see that she is not well, and I wish her to go home with me." Anna looked round in terror, and, rising hastily, took her husband's arm. "I will send to inquire for him and let you know," whispered Betsy. As Alexey Alexandrovitch left the pavilion with his wife, he spoke in his ordinary manner to all whom he met, and Anna was forced to listen and to reply as usual. But she was not herself, and as in a dream she passed along on her husband's arm. "Is he killed or not? Can it be true? Will he come? Shall I see him today?" she asked herself. In silence she got into Alexey Alexandrovitch's carriage, and she sat in silence as they left the throng of vehicles. In spite of all he had seen, Alexey Alexandrovitch did not allow himself to think of his wife's present attitude. He saw only the external signs. He saw that her deportment had been improper, and he felt obliged to speak to her about it, but it was very difficult not to say more, to say only that. He opened his mouth to tell her how improperly she had behaved, but, in spite of himself, he said something absolutely different. "How strange that we all like to see these cruel spectacles. I notice—" "What? I did not understand you," said Anna scornfully. He was wounded and instantly began to say what was on his mind. "I am obliged to tell you," he began. Now, thought Anna, comes the explanation, and a terrible feeling came over her. "I am obliged to tell you that your conduct today has been extremely improper," said he in French. "Wherein has my conduct been improper?" she demanded angrily, raising her head quickly and looking him straight in the eyes, no longer hiding her feelings under a mask of gaiety, but putting on a bold front, under which, with difficulty, she hid her fears. "Be careful," said he, pointing to the open window behind the coachman's back. He leaned forward and raised the pane. "What impropriety did you remark?" she asked again. "The despair which you took no pains to conceal when one of the riders was thrown." He awaited her answer, but she said nothing and looked straight ahead. "I have always requested you to so behave when in society that evil tongues cannot find anything to say against you. There was a time when I spoke of your inner feelings. I now say nothing about them. Now I speak only of outward appearances. You have behaved improperly, and I would ask you not to let this happen again." She did not hear half of his words. She felt overwhelmed with fear, and she thought only of Vronsky and whether he was killed. Was it he who was meant when they said the rider was safe but the horse had broken her back? When Alexey Alexandrovitch ceased speaking, she looked at him with an ironical smile and answered not a word, because she had not noticed what he said. At first he had spoken boldly, but as he saw clearly what he was speaking about, the terror which possessed her seized him also. He noticed that smile of hers, and it led him into a strange mistake. She is amused at my suspicions. She is going to tell me now what she said once before, that there is no foundation for them, that this is absurd. Now, when the discovery of the whole thing hung over him, he desired nothing so much as that she should answer derisively as she had done before, that his suspicions were ridiculous and had no foundation. What he now knew was so terrible to him that he was ready to believe anything she might say. But the expression of her gloomy and frightened face now allowed him no further chance of falsehood. "Possibly I am mistaken," said he. "In that case I beg you to forgive me." "No, you are not mistaken," she replied with measured words, casting a look of despair on her husband's icy face. "You are not mistaken. I was in despair, and I could not help being. I hear you, but I am thinking only of him. I love him. I am his mistress. I cannot endure you. I fear you. I hate you. Do with me what you please." And throwing herself into a corner of the carriage, she covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. Alexey Alexandrovitch did not move, or change the direction of his eyes, but his whole face suddenly assumed the solemn rigidity of a corpse, and this expression remained unchanged throughout the drive to the dacha. As they approached the house, he turned his head to her still with the same expression. "So, but I insist on the preservation of appearances until," and here his voice trembled, "I decide on the measures which I shall take to save my honor and communicate them to you." He stepped out of the carriage and assisted Anna out. Then, in the presence of the domestics, he shook hands with her, re-entered the carriage, and drove back to Petersburg. He had just gone when a lackey from Betsy brought a note to Anna. "I sent to Alexey Vronsky to learn how he was. He writes to tell me that he is safe and sound, but in despair. Then he will come," she thought. "How well I did to tell him all." She looked at her watch. Scarcely 3 hours had passed since she saw him, but the memory of their interview made her heart hot within her. "Bosmoi! How light it is! It is terrible. But I love to see his face, and I love this fantastic light. My husband. Oh, yes. Well, thank God it is all over with him." As in all places where human beings congregate, so in the little German village where the Shtcherbatskys went to take the waters, there is formed a sort of social crystallization which puts everyone in his exact and unchangeable place. Just as a drop of water exposed to the cold always and invariably takes a certain crystalline form, so each new individual coming to the spa immediately finds himself fixed in the place peculiar to him. Fürst Shtcherbatsky, samt Gemahlin und Tochter. Prince Shtcherbatsky, wife and daughter, both by the apartments that they occupied and by their name and the acquaintances that they found, immediately crystallized into the exact place that was predestined to receive them. This year a genuine German Fürstin or princess was at the spa, and in consequence the crystallization of society took place even more energetically than usual. The Russian princess felt called on to present her daughter to the German princess, and the ceremony took place 2 days after their arrival. Kitty, dressed in a very simple toilette, that is to say, a very elegant summer costume imported from Paris, made a low and graceful curtsy. The Fürstin said, "I hope that roses will soon bloom again in this pretty little face." And immediately the Shtcherbatsky family found themselves in the fixed and definite walk of life from which it was impossible to descend. They made the acquaintance of the family of an English lady, of a German Gräfin and her son who had been wounded in the late war, of a scientific man from Sweden, and of a Monsieur Quenu and his sister. But, for the most part, the Shtcherbatskys spontaneously formed social relations among the people from Moscow, among them Marya Yevgenyevna Rishevaya and her daughter, whom Kitty did not like because she likewise was ill on account of a love affair, and a Moscow colonel whom she had seen in society since childhood, and known by his uniform and his epaulets, and who now, with his little eyes and his bare neck and flowery cravats, seemed to Kitty supremely ridiculous, and the more unendurable because she could not get rid of him. When they were all established, it became very tiresome to Kitty, the more as her father had gone to Carlsbad and she and her mother were left alone. She could not interest herself in her old acquaintances, because she knew that she would not find anything novel in them, and so her principal amusement was in studying the people whom she had never seen before. It was in accordance with Kitty's nature to see the best side of people, especially of strangers, and now, in making her surmises about the persons whom she saw, who they were and what they were like and what relationship they bore to one another, she amused herself in imagining the most wonderful and beautiful characters, and found justification for her observations. Of all these people, there was one in whom she took a most lively interest. This was a young Russian girl who had come to the baths with a sick Russian lady named Madame Stahl. Madame Stahl belonged to the high nobility, but she was so ill that she could not walk, and only occasionally, on very fine days, appeared at the baths in a wheeled chair. But it was rather from pride than illness, as the princess judged, that she failed to make any acquaintances among the Russians. The girl was her nurse, and, as Kitty remarked, she frequently went to those who were seriously ill, and there were many at the baths, and with the most natural, unaffected zeal took care of them. This young Russian girl, Kitty discovered to her surprise, was no relation to Madame Stahl, or even a hired companion. Madame Stahl called her simply Varenka, but her friends called her Mademoiselle Varenka. Kitty not only found it extremely interesting to study the relations between this young girl and Madame Stahl, and other persons whom she did not know, but as often happens, she also felt an unaccountable sympathy drawing her toward Mademoiselle Varenka, and, when their eyes met, she imagined that it pleased her also. This Mademoiselle Varenka was not only no longer in her first youth, but she seemed like a creature without any youth. Her age might be guessed as either 19 or 30. If one analyzed her features, she was rather good-looking, in spite of the sickly pallor of her face. If her head had not been rather large, and her figure too slight, she would have been considered handsome. But she was not one to please men. She made one think of a beautiful flower, which, though still preserving its petals, was faded and without perfume. There was one other reason why she could not be attractive to men, and that was the fact that she lacked exactly what Kitty had in excess, the repressed fire of life and a consciousness of her fascination. Varenka seemed always absorbed in some important work, and therefore it seemed she could not take any interest in anything irrelevant. It was this very contrast to herself that especially attracted Kitty to her. Kitty felt that in her and in her mode of life she might find what she was seeking with so much trouble, an interest in life, the dignity of life outside of the social relationships of young women to young men, which now seemed to Kitty like an ignominious exposure of merchandise awaiting a purchaser. The more she studied her unknown friend, the more convinced she became that this girl was the most perfect creature which she could imagine, and the more she longed to become acquainted with her. The two girls passed each other many times every day, and every time they met Kitty's eyes seemed always to ask, "Who are you? What are you? Are you not, in truth, the charming person that I imagine you to be? But for heaven's sake, The look seemed to add, "Don't think that I would permit myself to demand your acquaintance. I simply admire you and love you." "I also love you, and you are very, very charming, and I would love you still better if I had time," replied the unknown maiden's look. And indeed Kitty saw that she was always busy. Either she was taking the children of a Russian family home from the baths, or carrying a plaid for an invalid and wrapping her up in it, or she was trying to divert some irritable sick man, or selecting and buying confections for some other sick persons. One morning, soon after the arrival of the Shtcherbatskys, two new persons appeared who immediately became the object of rather unfriendly criticism. The one was a very tall, stooping man with enormous hands, black eyes, at once innocent and terrifying, and wearing an old, ill-fitting short coat. The other was a pock-marked woman with a kindly face and dressed very badly and inartistically. Kitty instantly recognized that they were Russians, and in her imagination set to work constructing a beautiful and touching romance about them. But the princess, learning by the Kurlista, or list of arrivals, that this was Nikolai Levin and Marya Nikolaevna, explained to her what a bad man this Levin was, and all her illusions about these two persons vanished. The fact that he was Konstantin Levin's brother, even more than her mother's words, suddenly made these two people particularly repulsive to Kitty. This Levin, with his habit of twitching his head, aroused in her an unsurmountable feeling of repulsion. It seemed to her that in his great, wide eyes, as they persistently followed her, was expressed a sentiment of hatred and irony, and she tried to avoid meeting him. It was a stormy day. The rain fell all the morning, and the invalids with umbrellas thronged the gallery. Kitty and her mother, accompanied by the Muscovite colonel, playing the elegant in his European overcoat, bought ready-made in Frankfurt, were walking on one side of the gallery in order to avoid Nikolai Levin, who was on the other. Varenka, in her dark dress and a black hat, with the brim turned down, was walking up and down the whole length of the gallery with a little blind Frenchwoman. Each time that she and Kitty met, they exchanged friendly glances. "Mamma, may I speak with her?" asked Kitty, as she happened to be following her unknown friend and noticed that she was approaching the spring where they might meet. "Yes, if you wish it so much. I will inquire about her and make her acquaintance first," said her mother. "But what do you find especially interesting in her? She is only a lady's companion. If you like, I can speak to Madame Stahl. I knew her belle sœur," added the princess, proudly raising her head. Kitty knew that her mother was vexed because Madame Stahl seemed to avoid making her acquaintance, and she did not press the point. "How wonderfully charming she is," said she, as she saw Varenka give the blind French lady a glass. "See how lovely and gentle everything is that she does." "You amuse me with your engagements," replied the princess. "No, we had better go back," she added as she saw Levin approaching with Marya and a German doctor, with whom he was speaking in a loud and angry tone. As they turned to go back, suddenly they heard, not loud voices, but a cry. Levin had stopped and was shrieking. The doctor was also angry. A crowd was gathering around them. The princess and Kitty hurried away, but the colonel joined the throng to find out what the trouble was. After a few moments the colonel came back to him. "What was it?" asked the princess. "It's a shame and a disgrace," replied the colonel. "There's only one thing you need to fear, and that is to meet with Russians abroad. This tall gentleman was quarreling with his doctor, heaped indignities upon him for not attending to him as he wished, and finally he threatened him with his cane. It is simply disgraceful." "Oh, how unpleasant!" said the princess. "Well, how did it end?" "Fortunately that girl with a hat like a toadstool interfered. A Russian, it seems," said the colonel. "Mademoiselle Varenka?" joyously exclaimed Kitty. Yes. She went quicker than anyone else and took the gentleman by the arm and led him off." "There, mamma," said Kitty, "and you wonder at my enthusiasm for Varenka." The next morning Kitty, watching her unknown friend, noticed that Mademoiselle Varenka had the same relations with Levin and Marya as with her other protégés. She joined them and talked with them, and acted as interpreter to the woman, who did not know any language beside her own. Kitty again begged her mother even more urgently to let her become acquainted with Varenka, and though it was unpleasant to the princess to seem to be making advances to the haughty and exclusive Madame Stahl, she made some inquiries about Varenka, and learning enough to satisfy herself that there was no possible harm, though very little that was advantageous, in the proposed acquaintance, she went first to Varenka and introduced herself. Choosing a time when Kitty was at the spring and Varenka was opposite the baker's, the princess went up to her. "Allow me to introduce myself," said she with her dignified smile. "My daughter has taken a great fancy to you, but perhaps you do not know me. "It is more than reciprocal, princess," replied Varenka quickly. "What a good thing you did yesterday toward our wretched fellow countryman," said the princess. Varenka blushed. "I do not remember," she replied. "I don't think I did anything." "Yes, indeed. You saved this Levin from an unpleasant affair." "Ah, yes. Ce compagnon called me, and I tried to calm him. He is very sick, and dissatisfied with his doctor. I am quite used to this kind of invalids. Oh, yes. I have heard that you live at Metoni with your aunt, Madame Stahl. I used to know her belle-sœur." "No, Madame Stahl is not my aunt. I call her maman, but I am no relation to her. I was brought up by her," replied Varenka, again blushing. All this was said with perfect simplicity, and the expression of her pleasing face was so frank and sincere that the princess began to understand why Kitty was so charmed by this Varenka. "Well, and what is this Levin going to do?" she asked. "He is going away." At this moment Kitty, radiant with pleasure because her mother had made the acquaintance of her unknown friend, came in from the spring. "See here, Kitty, your ardent desire to know Mademoiselle—" "Varenka," said the girl smilingly. "Everyone calls me so." Kitty was flushed with delight, and without speaking long pressed her new friend's hand, which gave no answering pressure, but lay passive in hers. Her hand gave no answering pressure, but Mademoiselle Varenka's face shone with a quiet, joyous, though melancholy smile, which showed her large but handsome teeth. "I have been longing to know you," said she. "But you are so busy." "Oh, on the contrary, I haven't anything to do," replied Varenka, but at the same instant she had to leave her new acquaintances because two little Russian girls, the daughter of an invalid, ran to her. "Varenka, mamma is calling," they cried, and Varenka followed them. The particulars which the princess learned about Varenka's past life, and her relations with Madame Stahl, and about Madame Stahl herself, were as follows. Madame Stahl had always been a sickly and excitable woman, who was said by some to have tormented the life out of her husband, and by others to have been tormented by his unnatural behavior. After she was divorced from her husband, she gave birth to her first child, which did not live. And Madame Stahl's parents, knowing her sensitiveness, and fearing that the shock would kill her, substituted for the dead child the daughter of a court cook, born on the same night and in the same house at Petersburg. This was Varenka. Madame Stahl afterwards learned that the child was not her own, but continued to take charge of her, the more willingly as the true parents shortly after died. For more than 10 years Madame Stahl lived abroad, in the south, never leaving her bed. Some said that she was a woman who had made a public show of her piety and good works. Others said that she was at heart the most highly moral of women, and that she lived only for the good of her neighbor, that she was really what she pretended to be. No one knew whether she was Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. One thing alone was certain, that she had friendly relations with the high dignitaries of all the churches and of all communions. Varenka always lived with Madame Stahl abroad, and all who knew Madame Stahl knew Mademoiselle Varenka also, and loved her. When she had learned all the particulars, the princess found nothing objectionable in her daughter's acquaintance with Varenka, the more because Varenka had the most cultivated manners and a fine education. She spoke French and English admirably, and chief of all she brought from Madame Stahl her regrets that, owing to her illness, she was deprived of the pleasure of making the princess's acquaintance. After she had once made Varenka's acquaintance, Kitty became more and more attached to her friend, and each day discovered some new charm in her. The princess, having discovered that Varenka sang well, invited her to come and give them an evening of music. Kitty plays, and we have a piano, not a very good instrument, to be sure, but you would give us great pleasure, said the princess, with her hypocritical smile, which was displeasing to Kitty, especially as she knew that Varenka did not want to sing. But Varenka came that same evening and brought her music. The princess had invited Marya Yevgenyevna and her daughter and the colonel. Varenka seemed perfectly indifferent to the presence of these people, who were strangers to her, and she went to the piano without being urged. She could not accompany herself, but in singing she read the notes perfectly. Kitty, who played very well, accompanied her. "You have a remarkable talent," said the princess after the first song, which Varenka sang beautifully. Marya Yevgenyevna and her daughter added their compliments and their thanks. "See," said the colonel, looking out of the window, "what an audience you have attracted." In fact, a large number of people had gathered in front of the house. "I am very glad to have given you pleasure," said Varenka, without affectation. Kitty looked at her friend proudly. She admired her art and her voice and her face, and, more than all, she was enthusiastic over the way in which Varenka made it evident that she took little account of her singing, and was perfectly indifferent to compliments. She simply seemed to say, "Shall I sing some more, or is that enough?" "If I were in your place, how proud I should be! How happy I should be to see that crowd under the window! But she seems perfectly unconscious of it. All that she seemed to want was not to refuse, but to please maman. What is there about her? What is it that gives her this power of indifference, this calmness and independence? How I should like to learn this of her," thought Kitty, as she looked into her peaceful face. The princess asked Varenka to sing again, and she sang this time as well as the first, with the same care and the same perfection, standing erect near the piano, and beating time with her thin brown hand. The next piece in her music roll was an Italian aria. Kitty played the introduction and looked at Varenka. "Let us not do that one," she said, blushing. Kitty, in alarm and wonder, fixed her eyes on Varenka's face. "Well, another one," she said, hastily turning the pages and somehow feeling an intuition that the Italian song brought back to her friend some painful association. "No," replied Varenka, putting her hand on the notes and smiling. "Let us sing this." And she sang it as calmly and coolly as the one before. After the singing was over, they all thanked her again and went out into the dining room to drink tea. Kitty and Varenka went down into the little garden next to the house. "You had some association with that song, did you not?" asked Kitty. "You need not tell me about it," she hastened to add. "Simply say, 'Yes, I have.'" "Why should I not tell you about it? Yes, there is an association," said Varenka calmly, and not waiting for Kitty to say anything. "And it is a painful one. I once loved a man, and used to sing that piece to him." Kitty, with wide open eyes, looked at Varenka meekly, but did not speak. "I loved him, and he loved me also, but his mother was unwilling, and he married some one else. He does not live very far from us now, and I sometimes see him. You didn't think that I also had my romance, did you?" And her face lighted up with a rare beauty and a fire such as Kitty imagined might have been habitual in other days. "Why shouldn't I have thought so? If I were a man I could never have loved any one else after knowing you," said Kitty. "What I cannot conceive is, that he was able to forget you, and make you unhappy for the sake of obeying his mother. He couldn't have had any heart." "Oh, no. He was an excellent man, and I am not unhappy. On the contrary, I am very happy. Well, shall we sing any more this evening?" she added, starting to go toward the house. "How good you are! How good you are!" cried Kitty, and stopping her, she kissed her. "If I could only be a bit like you!" "Why should you resemble anyone else besides yourself? You are a good girl as you are," said Varenka, with her sweet and melancholy smile. "No, I am not good at all. Now, tell me, stay, let us sit down for a little while," said Kitty, drawing her down into a settee near by. "Tell me how it can be other than a pain to think of a man who has scorned your love, who has jilted you." "But no, he did not scorn it at all. I'm sure that he loved me. But he was a dutiful son, and—" "Yes, but suppose it had not been for his mother's sake, but simply of his own free will," said Kitty, feeling that she was betraying her secret, and her face, glowing red with mortification, convicted her. "Then he would not have behaved honourably, and I should not mourn for him," replied Varenka, perceiving that the supposition concerned, not herself, but Kitty. "But the insult!" cried Kitty. "One cannot forgive the insult. It is impossible," said she, remembering her own look when the music stopped at the last ball. "Whose insult? You didn't act badly." "Worse than badly, shamefully." Varenka shook her head, and laid her hand on Kitty's. "Well, but why shamefully?" she asked. "You surely did not tell a man who showed indifference to you that you loved him?" "Certainly not. I never uttered a word. But he knew it. There are looks, there are ways. No, no, not if I lived 100 years should I ever forget it." "Now, what is it? I don't understand you. The question is solely this: do you love him now or not?" said Varenka, who liked to call things by their right names. "I hate him, but I cannot forgive myself." "But what for?" "The shame, the insult. Ah, if everyone were as sensitive as you! There is never a young girl who does not sometimes feel the same way. It is all such a trifling thing." "But what, then, is important?" asked Kitty, looking at Varenka with astonishment and curiosity. "Oh, many things are important," replied Varenka with a smile. "Yes, but what?" "Oh, there are many things more important," replied Varenka, not knowing what to say, but at that moment the voice of the princess was heard from the window. "Kitty, it is getting cool. Put on your shawl, or come in." "It is time to go," said Varenka, getting up. "I must go and see Madame Berthe. She asked me to come." Kitty held her by the hand, and her eyes, full of passionate, almost supplicating, curiosity, asked her: "What is it that is so important that can give you such calm? You know. Tell me." But Varenka did not understand the meaning of Kitty's look. She remembered only that she had still to go to see Madame Berthe, and to get home at midnight for tea with maman. She went back to the room, picked up her music, and, having said good night to all, started to go. "Allow me, I will escort you," said the colonel. "Certainly," said the princess. "How could you go home alone at night? I was going to send Parasha with you." Kitty saw that Varenka could hardly keep from smiling at the idea that she needed anyone to go home with her. "No, I always go home alone, and nothing ever happens to me," said she, taking her hat, and after kissing Kitty again, though she did not tell her the one important thing, she hurried away with firm steps, her music roll under her arm, and disappeared in the semi-darkness of the summer's night, carrying with her her secret of "what is important," and what gave her her enviable calmness and dignity. Kitty also made Madame Stahl's acquaintance, and her relations with this lady and her friendship with Varenka had not only a powerful influence on her, but also soothed her grief. She found this consolation in the fact that, through this friendship, there opened before her an entirely new world, which had nothing in common with her past, a beautiful, supernal world, from the lofty heights of which she could look down calmly on her past. She discovered that this world, which was entirely apart from the instinctive life which she had hitherto led, was the spiritual life. This life was reached by religion, a religion which had nothing in common with the religion to which Kitty had been accustomed since infancy, a religion which consisted of going to morning and evening service, and to the House of Windows, where she met her acquaintances, or of learning by heart Slavonic texts with the parish priest. This was a lofty, mystic religion, united with the purest thoughts and feelings, and believed in not because one was commanded to do so, but through love. Kitty learned all this, but not by words. Madame Stahl talked to her as to a dear child whom she loved as the type of her own youth, and only once did she make any allusion to the consolation brought by faith and love for human sorrows, and to the compassion of Christ, who looked on no sorrows as insignificant, and she immediately changed the subject. But in all this lady's motions, in her words, in her heavenly looks, as Kitty called them, and, above all, in the story of her life, which she knew through Varenka, Kitty discovered the important thing, which till now had been but a sealed book to her. But, lofty as Madame Stahl's character was, touching as was her history, high-minded and affectionate her discourse, Kitty could not help noticing certain peculiarities which troubled her. One day, for example, when her relatives were mentioned, Madame Stahl smiled disdainfully. It was contrary to Christian charity. Another time Kitty noticed, when she met a Roman Catholic dignitary calling on her, that Madame Stahl kept her face carefully shaded by the curtain, and smiled peculiarly. Insignificant as these two incidents were, they gave her some pain, and caused her to doubt Madame Stahl's sincerity. Varenka, on the other hand, alone in the world, without family connections, without friends, hoping for naught, harboring no ill will after her bitter disappointment, seemed to her absolute perfection. Through Varenka she learned how to forget herself, and to love her neighbor, if she wanted to be happy, calm, and good. And Kitty did wish this, and, when once she learned what was the important thing, Kitty was no longer willing simply to admire, but gave herself up with her whole heart to the new life which opened before her. After the stories which Varenka told her of Madame Stahl and others whom she named, Kitty drew up a plan for her coming life. She decided that, following the example of Aline, Madame Stahl's niece, whom Varenka often told her about, she would visit the unhappy, no matter where she might be living, and that she would aid them to the best of her ability, that she would distribute the gospel, read the New Testament to the sick, to the dying, to criminals. The thought of reading the New Testament to criminals, as this Aline had done, especially appealed to Kitty. But she indulged in these dreams secretly, without telling them to her mother or even to her friend. However, while she was waiting to be able to carry out her schemes on a wider scale, it was easy for Kitty to put her new principles in practice at the waters, and even then and there at the spa, where the sick and unhappy are easily found, and she did as Varenka did. The princess swiftly noticed that Kitty had fallen under the powerful influence of her engagement with Madame Stahl, as she called it, and particularly with Varenka. She saw that Kitty imitated Varenka, not only in her deeds of charity, but even in her gait, in her speech, in her way of shutting her eyes. Later she discovered that her daughter was passing through a sort of crisis of the soul quite independent of the influence of her friends. The princess saw that Kitty was reading the Gospels evenings in a French Testament loaned her by Madame Stahl, a thing which she had never done before. She also noticed that she avoided her society friends, and gave her time to the sick under Varenka's care, and particularly to the poor family of a sick painter named Petrov. Kitty seemed proud to fill, in this household, the functions of a sister of charity. All this was very good, and the princess had no fault to find with it, and opposed it all the less from the fact that Petrov's wife was a woman of good family, and that one day the Fürstin, noticing Kitty's charitable activity, had praised her and called her the ministering angel. All would have been very good if it had not been carried to excess. But the princess saw that her daughter was going to extremes, so she spoke to her about it. Il ne faut rien outré. One must never go to extremes, she said to her. But her daughter made no reply. She only questioned from the bottom of her heart whether one could ever talk about going to extremes in the matter of religion. How could there be any possibility of extremes in following the teachings which bid you offer your left cheek when the right has been struck, and to give your shirt when your cloak is taken from you? But the princess was displeased with this tendency to exaggeration, and she was still more displeased to feel that Kitty was unwilling to open her heart to her. In point of fact, Kitty kept secret from her mother her new views and feelings. She kept them secret, not because she lacked affection or respect for her mother, but simply because she was her mother. It would have been easier to confess them to a stranger than to her mother. "It is a long time since Anna Pavlovna has been to see us," said the princess one day, speaking of Madame Petrov. "I invited her to come, but she seems offended." "No, I don't think so, maman," replied Kitty, with a guilty look. "You have not been with her lately, have you?" "We plan to walk on the mountain for to-morrow," said Kitty. "I see no objection," replied the princess, noticing her daughter's confusion, and trying to fathom the reason. That same day Varenka came to dinner and announced that Anna Pavlovna had given up the proposed expedition. The princess noticed that Kitty again blushed. "Kitty, has there been anything unpleasant between you and the Petrovs?" she asked, as soon as they were alone. "Why have they ceased to send their children, or to come themselves?" Kitty replied that nothing had happened, and that she really did not understand why Anna Pavlovna seemed to be angry with her, and she told the truth. She did not know the reasons for the change in Madame Petrov, but she suspected them, and thus also she suspected a thing which she dared not to confess, even to herself, still less to her mother. This was one of those things which you know, but which are impossible to speak even to yourself, so humiliating and painful would it be if you are mistaken. Again and again she passed in review all the memories of her relations with this family. She remembered the innocent joy which shone on Anna Pavlovna's honest, round face when they first met. She remembered their secret discussions to find means to distract the invalid and keep him from the forbidden work, and to get him out of doors, the attachment of the youngest child, who called her Moya Kitty, and would not go to bed without her. How beautiful everything was at that time! Then she remembered Petrov's thin face, his long neck stretching out from his brown coat, his thin curly hair, his blue eyes with their questioning look, which she had feared at first, his painful efforts to seem lively and energetic when she was near. She recalled the effort that she had to make at first to overcome the repugnance which he, as well as all consumptives, caused her to feel, and the trouble which she had in finding something to talk with him about. She remembered the sick man's humble and timid looks when he saw her, and the strange feeling of compassion and awkwardness which came over her at first, followed by the pleasant consciousness of her charitable deeds. How lovely it had all been, but it lasted only for a brief moment. Now, and for several days, there had been a sudden change. Anna Pavlovna received Kitty with pretended friendliness, and did not cease to watch her and her husband. Could it be that the invalid's pathetic joy at the sight of her was the cause of Anna Pavlovna's coolness? Yes, she said to herself, there was something unnatural and quite different from her ordinary sweet temper when she said to me day before yesterday, sharply, "There, he will not do anything without you. He would not even take his coffee, though he is awfully faint." Yes, perhaps it was not agreeable to her when I gave him his plaid. It was such a simple thing to do, but he seemed so strange, and thanked me so warmly, that I felt ill at ease. And then that portrait of me which he painted so well, but above all his gentle and melancholy look. Yes, yes, it must be so, Kitty repeated with horror. No, it cannot be, it must not be. He is to be pitied so, she added in her secret heart. This suspicion poisoned the pleasure of her new life.